Distinguished gentlemen, ladies, and guests joining us from COP26 in Glasgow, from across the world, and in Scotland. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Albert Lihalaha, the Deputy Head of the Independent Integrity Unit of the Green Climate Fund. On behalf of the GCF, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this COP26 side event on enhancing integrity to avoid maladaptation. This is a hybrid session with panelists from Glasgow and others joining virtually from across the globe. The event is being streamed online, but a recording will be made available on the IIU page of the GCF website. We're here today to begin a dialogue on what we believe is a very important topic with far-reaching implications. Here at COP26 and in forums from around the world, climate change adaptation has received considerable attention from donors, governments, communities alike. It is no secret that people and communities are now facing detrimental effects of climate change, and ensuring robust, effective, and sustainable adaptation action is crucially important. However, there's still a lot to learn about what constitutes successful adaptation. It is only recently that the academic and policy communities have begun paying attention to the prospect that adaptation actions can lead to increased climate risk and ultimately what is known as maladaptation. While there may be a combination of factors that contribute to this phenomenon, integrity concerns remain a cross-cutting issue and must be addressed by incorporating transparency, accountability, and good governance from the inception to the implementation of climate projects. Considering the increasing levels of international climate finance committed to promoting adaptation in vulnerable communities, there is a need to continued emphasis on understanding maladaptation from an integrity perspective. This session is intended to play a role in doing just that. By instigating and encouraging further discourse on this important and emerging topic, we can collectively begin finding solutions and remediating maladaptation. Today, we're very fortunate to have a cross-organizational team of leaders and academics from the Green Climate Fund, the Water Integrity Network, the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, Transparency International, GIZ, and the University of Witwatersrand. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those organizations for their valuable contributions in putting together the thematic brief. It is also my honor to introduce our moderator, Dr. Puri, Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. Spanning years of experience in international development and academia, Jo comes with no shortage of accolades. She's had a remarkable career as a strategist, advisor, evaluator, professor, and author of many academic publications. Jo has also served in senior roles with numerous international organizations, including the GCF, UNEP, UNDP, and the World Bank. We're also very happy to have with us our keynote speaker and a true champion for climate action, Yannick Glemarec, Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. Despite his hectic schedule, Yannick has been an ardent supporter of instilling integrity values in GCF-funded activities. Thank you very much for joining us. Before yielding the floor to Yannick, just a couple of quick note. Following the keynote address, there will be an official launch of the thematic brief on enhancing integrity to avoid maladaptation. We will then proceed to a short video and panel discussions. Over to you, Yannick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert. Dear participants in Glasgow and online, welcome to this critical event. At the onset, I would like to deeply thank and congratulate GCF Independent Integrated Unit for organizing a discussion on a topic that is not easy, but which is critical, the importance of integrity to avoid maladaptation. I believe that one of the key results of COP26 so far is the recognition that we must scale up our adaptation effort at the same pace than our mitigation effort. When the famous climatologist James Hansen in the 80s said that we will see the first manifestation of climate change at the turn of the millennium, most people thought that he was an alarmist. Unfortunately not. I believe that 19 out of the 20 warmest years on record have happened since the turn of the millennium. And for the most vulnerable countries in the world, climate change is not something that might happen according to a mathematical model in 10, 15, 20 years. Climate change is a reality that we have been living for years. And so we need to scale up dramatically adaptation efforts. This will require us to update, if not to throw away, a number of our engineering textbook, because suddenly we will have, for example, to design an infrastructure to be able to withstand a number of different possible climate future. And it's not an easy task. When Hurricane Mitch hit Honduras in October 1998, it's basically destroyed 70% of the crops, 70 to 80% of the transport infrastructure, and cost at least 70% of the GDP of the country. One bridge did withstand the hurricane, completely intact. And this bridge was over the Choluteca River. Why? Because the designer of this bridge in 1986 were aware that Honduras was an extremely vulnerable country. And therefore, they really look again at every single textbook on how to build bridge and build a bridge that could withstand a very strong hurricane. The problem is that the water, the Choluteca River water, do not flow under the bridge anymore. It's flow beside the bridge, because basically the flood did force the river to change its course. And the roads leading to the bridge and the road leading from the bridge were swept away. So now we have a super bridge standing in the middle of nowhere. And here we're speaking about engineers who knew that they had to design the bridge differently, but they took an engineering approach, not obligatory looking at the entire systemic resilience approach. And this will be repeated on and on and on and on and on. We are bound to repeat this kind of mistakes thousands of times, because adaptation is simply not easy. And avoiding maladaptation should be one of our greatest priorities in the years to come, making sure that we actually do not increase the risk on people by trying to mitigate it. And so you could be wondering, okay, are we now to have a presentation on the climate modeling systems? Why? What does it have to do with integrity? The climate change and corruption have a lot of common points. The first thing is that both hit the poor, hit the most vulnerable, the hardest. The second thing is that both can kill, and can kill a lot of people. The integrity, basically corruption, will deter investment. You are not to basically invest in a given infrastructure if you are not convinced that the policy support that you are receiving might not be there in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And deterring investment at the moment when we need to scale up effort is something very serious. And it's not all. Corruption also affects the effectiveness of public policies. Our most powerful instrument to protect people, public policies basically have next to no effectiveness in a low integrity environment. For example, you can come with the nicest possible land zoning policy to make sure that people do not settle in flood-prone areas, are not put in harm's way. But if because of corruption, developers can still get a license, a permit, you will end up with a lot of people who will basically maybe suffer grave casualties at the next flood. Another thing about corruption is that it's also affect the quality of the design of the construction and the operation and maintenance of infrastructure. Your infrastructure, if it's supposed to, for example, include a certain type of reinforcement that disappear magically during the preparation process, will not serve the duty of care that is supposed to be. And corruption basically makes it next to impossible for us to learn. These will be very difficult to understand what has gone wrong, what has gone right, if you have a major problem of integrity. And as I've mentioned earlier, we are bound to make a lot of mistakes. And there's nothing wrong with that if we learn from them. And corruption will prevent us from learning from it. And that's the reason why integrity, enhancing integrity is so important to avoid maladaptation. And I'm deeply grateful to my colleagues for taking the lead on this discussion.
Thank you very much, Yannick, for a very comprehensive overview of the issue. It's my pleasure to present to you the brief on enhancing integrity to avoid maladaptation. And thank you for launching it.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Ibrahim, and congratulations to you and to your team and all the community that is supporting your efforts.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you, Yannick. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. If I may take a few moments to beg the audience's indulgence here. I believe that the crew in Glasgow would like to take a photograph, an official photograph. We will resume very shortly. Thank you. Thank you very much for your indulgence. We will now invite you to watch a short video to help introduce the topic and highlight some potential ways forward to ensure that adaptation projects do not fall in the maladaptation trap.
The world is in the grip of the climate crisis. Both predictable and unpredictable impacts are unfolding across continents. One way to mitigate the impact is through adaptation, projects that adjust the actual or expected effects of climate change. For small island developing states, African states, and least developed countries, adaptation is crucial. According to estimates, the cost is likely to range from $140 to $300 billion annually by 2030. The Green Climate Fund has committed to delivering 50% of its financing to climate adaptation that prioritizes vulnerable countries. The significant amount of investment raises the risk for corruption, mismanagement, and integrity failures. In turn, it may result in maladaptation. Maladaptation aggravates existing climate risks or creates new unintended risks for the communities in the area. Take this example. A government agency financed an adaptation project to relocate nomad communities from areas vulnerable to floods and droughts. But the program ended up disrupting their lives, alienating them from their traditional lands and water resources. Vested interests of decision makers, coupled with corrupt behavior of high-level public officials, resulted in widespread discrimination against minorities, causing conflict, violence, and human rights violations. Although a mix of factors result in maladaptation, we also see integrity failure, a cross-cutting issue, as a significant cause. We need to ensure that integrity and anti-corruption measures are embedded in the projects from beginning to end. Corrupt decision-making in adaptation projects and programs may be driven by opportunities to make money, short-term political agendas, the capture of resources and power, or opaque decision-making that excludes vulnerable groups, minorities, women, and youth. Powerful lobbies from dominant sectors like mining, agriculture, or the water sector can assert their influence in the process. Some adaptation projects can only be sham adaptation, designed to benefit only a few. As climate action and integrity champions, what can we do? First, we advocate for further research across key adaptation sectors to understand the consequences of corruption. Second, we identify best practices and share lessons learned in reducing corruption. Third, we encourage collective action at the global, national, and local levels to reduce corruption risks. Fourth, we develop tools and undertake integrity risk assessments to mitigate integrity failures. Fifth, we ensure greater transparency in project monitoring and inclusive participation in the decision-making and accountability process. And finally, we promote zero tolerance for corruption by imposing consequences and corrective measures. We also champion whistleblower protection and encourage people to report prohibited practices. The need for adaptation is urgent. We must act together to safeguard these projects for our planet.
We've now reached the second part of the program, panel discussions. But before I hand the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Puri, just a few obligatory housekeeping reminders. The moderator will address the questions to the panelists with a maximum response time of 7 minutes. There may be follow-up questions depending on the availability of time. We will request panelists to be succinct in their response and interventions. Participants joining us from online are invited to send their questions through the link found on the invitation description just below the live stream. Depending on the availability of time, the floor will be open for questions towards the end of the panel discussion. If we cannot get to your question, we will work to respond to them and make them available on the IIU website. I now have the pleasure of handing the floor over to Dr. Joe Puri. You have the privilege of introducing our panel members. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Albert. Such a privilege again for me to be here. I thought I'd take a page from the video that was presented, perhaps present a couple of my own comments as part of the initial part of this session, and then use the moderator's privilege to then introduce our speakers one by one, right? So I come from the independent, I beg your pardon. For those who know me, that was definitely Freudian. So I come from the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, is committed to poverty action for rural people, which essentially means that we've been working in the context of making rural people resilient over the past 30 years without calling it adaptation. A key part of understanding adaptation is recognizing that we've got to also be able to guard against maladaptation. And I really appreciated the video that was presented in that context. But one of the key questions that keeps appearing as we are making our decisions at IFAD is, well, what counts as adaptation? Because if we don't know what counts as adaptation and what works for adaptation and what doesn't, for whom and why, there is a very high risk that it's going to be maladaptive. In the context of the conversation that we are seeing here today and the past couple of weeks, I have come to this COP thinking this is not just a COP which is going to be discussing deforestation, mitigation efforts and mitigation goals, but is also a credibility COP. It's really important as we make our commitments clear, as countries come forward, as agencies come forward, that we also think about how credible the commitments are. and whether they are being informed by high quality evidence. In this context, IFAD really puts in resources to understand what works and what doesn't in the context of our investments for the rural poor. 15% of our overall portfolio has rigorous impact assessments that are undertaken to generate high quality evidence. Because unless you have high quality evidence, you're going to be held hostage by agenda that are not objective. And that is a very high risk, especially as you start to think about scaling up resources for adaptation. One of the other things that we have recognized within IFAD, and I think in the international community as well, is although there has been a commitment of a 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation, clearly there's not a lot of resources going into adaptation. In a study that we supported last year, we found that for every $18 that's going into mitigation internationally, so additional and new climate flows, only $1 is going into adaptation. As the world community decides to take this on, and there is a clarion call out for increased resources and funding for adaptation, it is clear that there is going to be some amount of scale up. But with scale up comes the risk of not having sufficient evidence on what works and what doesn't, and therefore what is maladaptive. I'm going to close with two examples as well before I get to the speakers on this panel. 3 weeks ago, I was in Kenya. And one of the projects and investments that IFAD has been focusing on has been really to try and get people to move away from a food system or a food cropping system that was imposed on them because of large corporations' interests. A lot of people in large parts of Kenya have been growing maize. While recognizing that this is not their traditional crop, and this is not something that has been part of the overall nutritional patterns that have been recognized as being context specific as well as context positive. In this case, we've been working very closely in a participatory way with farmers on the ground to understand how they can go back to traditional cropping methods, as well those that are resilient to climate shocks, but also are very positive with respect to traditional nutritional and consumption patterns. So to move to sorghum. But this is one consequence as well of thinking about adaptation in a large scale, that unless we have really good ideas on what can objectively work to increase not just climate resilience, but also helps to improve equity, also keeps in mind the rights and agency of vulnerable and marginalized populations, and also looks at gender, youth, creation of jobs, there is a very high likelihood that we are going to be watching and seeing and witnessing maladaptive activities. So keeping in mind that it is the voice, the agency, equity considerations that need to be taken into consideration as we move along and as we plan our investments is really key as we think about adaptation, but also about mitigation. My quick other example is that of, again, in Mozambique, as well as in other parts of Eastern Kenya, where large communities have moved to eucalyptus growing. Eucalyptus growing in drought-prone areas is probably the worst thing that you can do. But again, this was something that was promoted by companies that were seedling companies, but wanted to see, eucalyptus plants being grown into trees. This is absolutely the worst thing that you can do in drought-prone areas, because eucalyptus actually consumes 3 times the amount of water than other traditional trees do. That's been something that we're trying to reverse as well. But again, these ideas could have very well just stayed on and contributed to maladaptation in these spaces. And knowing with evidence that these are not good solutions is really key as we go forward. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn to the panel. So first, let me introduce Coleen Vogel from the University, Dr. Coleen Vogel from the University of Witwatersrand. It's really a huge privilege for me to be introducing Dr. Coleen Vogel. Coleen is a climatologist by training, but has been increasingly working on the social dimensions of climate change and has been focusing particularly on climate adaptation. She is the vice chair of International Global Environmental Change Scientific Communities and has been involved in the Earth System Science Program. She has been chapter lead author and co-author of chapters in the IPCC 4th and 5th assessment reports. And she has also received the Bertoni Award for International Excellence in Adaptation Research, as well as the University of the Witwatersrand Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Coleen, my question for you. First question, so you have about 6 minutes, I think, is that there's a combination of factors that can cause a project to fall into the maladaptation trap. The maladaptation discourse, through looking at the maladaptation discourse through an integrity perspective, is quite a recent occurrence. As an academic who has done significant research on adaptation, how can the lack of integrity as well as anti-corruption measures lead to maladaptation? Could you give us your comments on that? And then also perhaps tell us as to what research and literature tells us on the concrete benefits of adopting strong institutional safeguard integrity measures. Over to you, Coleen.
Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. As you know, these are very tough questions, as we just heard in the introductory video that was shown. I just want to backtrack a little bit and just lay the ground for understanding some concepts, because I think in most of our work in adaptation, we've always been focusing very strongly on vulnerability. And so when we talk about climate change and what it does to particularly the marginal, there are two ways of looking at it. The one is to look at the hazard, which is the biophysical dimensions. And then you might get led down a whole series of adaptation efforts, which could focus on technologies. So you're really trying to, A, prevent the direct cause of the problem, which in this case might be your aerosols and your greenhouse gases. But you also might miss a trick. And in particular, we would argue in the adaptation community and those of us who have been doing this work for many, many years, that it's the vulnerability dimension that is really critical. To what extent are areas, environments, and people made exposed or found to be vulnerable in the face of some of these hazards? So coming back to your question, I think the work that most of us have done, we've been working on this for many, many years. It started primarily in very often rural contexts, working in small communities, because adaptation in many cases is very localized. And obviously the big issue now is going to be coming to how do we scale up? And then the integrity issues take on another dimension completely. But I want to come back because I think the vulnerability thread or the issue is the golden thread through all the studies that we have analyzed. So if you fail to, A, understand what you're dealing with, so many of the funding projects, for example, that we've been engaged in, not all of them are bad. Obviously, some of them are very, very good. But those where the funders want quick wins, they want quick solutions, it lends itself sometimes to elite capture. It lends itself sometimes to those areas being exposed and investigated that are not necessarily off the beaten track, but are close to areas where you can get easy access, tick a box, find out who's vulnerable, do very superficial vulnerability work. And I think that's where you start to run into issues of integrity and in particular to creating maladaptation. So as soon as you, I would argue, fail to really pay attention to the vulnerability context in which you are operating, that is when I think you run the risk, A, of exposing people to issues of corruption and integrity, but also to making people more vulnerable as opposed to making people more robust. I don't particularly like the word resilient because I think we've been trying to make people resilient without addressing the root causes of the structural controls that are driving these vulnerabilities. So in the part of the world where I live near an informal township or settlement area, we have repeated floods. And many times we rush out with well-meaning biscuits and blankets, which seem to be good for coping mechanisms, but we're not really dealing with the actual drivers that are forcing people into city areas and that are forcing people and compelling them to live in marginalized areas. So it's not a great surprise when a storm that might be not great in magnitude from a hazard perspective suddenly causes major losses and discomforts and vulnerabilities at a much, much more local scale. So I just want to wrap up briefly what I've been trying to say. I would say the root problem is that we tend to rush in. We don't spend enough time and trust building. Now, I know we've got time against us because we have got this very small window of opportunity to turn things around in the wider climate change discourse. But I think the problem is that we are doing a lot of development work, very well-meaning work, as you yourself said. You've been working on adaptation for many years before it was called adaptation. But I think the retrofitting of adaptation into existing development agendas just to get a few extra bucks on the table is highly problematic. And if we were doing development appropriately, we might not have issues and concerns necessarily with adaptation. So I just want to give you 4 points. We've investigated 34 cases in a paper that we recently wrote. It was led by a colleague, good friend of mine, Siri Eriksson. The first is a shallow understanding of the vulnerability context, quick wins, going for the most accessible and not really deep dives into vulnerability generation factors. Number 2, inequitable actor participation in both the design and the implementation. We heard about this with the rather tragic case of the bridge building. If the engineers had just asked perhaps people who live in the area, who've experienced similar kinds of conditions, and maybe had been a little bit more humble and spoken to local practitioners instead of only seeking technology and science, they might have found some different responses. Then the third one, retrofitting adaptation into existing development agendas. In other words, dressing up things in new clothes, but you're not really solving the problems. And then fourthly, a lack of engagement of what is defining adaptation success. I think that's a big question going forward. Success will be defined on some of the parameters you bring into and the paradigms, the framings of your intervention. So in conclusion, I would argue then a good understanding of vulnerability is needed. We need to really start identifying those drivers, both global and local, of what is constituting the vulnerabilities and the need for adaptation in the first place. Is this, the market economies? Do we need to be rethinking our well-being economy and our GDP and how our economies are defined? Those are big, big, big questions. And I don't want to get into those because that'll take another 2 weeks, I think, at COP just to unravel those, although there is some effort going on that as well. And then really trying to understand the intersectionality of the multi-scalar processes that drive vulnerability. So yes, these are tough questions, but I think we've got enough stuff on the table that if we started probing these effectively, as the previous speaker said, if we're open to the learning, I think we can, and particularly learning with the people that we're engaging and not for the people that we're engaging with, I think we'll go a long way. Thanks very much for the chance to respond.
Thank you so much, Coleen. Very briefly, I'm going to give you 45 seconds, but could you say a little bit about how you think academics can help to inform this space?
Yeah, I think academics have a lot that we can offer, particularly not only through the integrated assessment processes of both the IPCC, but also the IPBES, the biodiversity assessment. So there, especially where we are trying to be not policy prescriptive, but trying to bring a huge cohort of evidence base, I think that is really, it's been the most successful ways we've gone about it in the past. So that is definitely a case. But I'd like to take my academic hat and mix it with another hat. I'm a firm believer in being a pracademic. Where I come from in Johannesburg, it's no good me sitting in a university behind walls and throwing papers over the walls and expecting people to come and get them of how to be adaptive and how to be have integrity in these areas. I need to get out there. And the trick is, do you become an activist? And I think some scientists are now saying we need to become more activated. But I prefer to use the word pracademic. So I'm still an academic. I still want to do good science so that it's robust and can really be taken as credible and noteworthy. But I also want to make a difference as I'm going along. So I've been working with the City of Johannesburg for 6 years now. I've worked with the youth. We've helped them craft their climate action plan. That's the way I think we can do it. So both by doing good science, but being academics with our hands and our feet on the ground.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pracademic Coleen. That was lovely, and I also noted that I think I took away actually a few of the lessons. So definitely participatory methods. If we can really address some of the root causes of vulnerability and really also consider, I'm paraphrasing this, but really bringing in equity, the equity dimension, and not go for quick wins. Ensure that this is not just about retrofitting and then engaging not just with some sections of the population, but across the board, and then ensuring that this is a multi-scale effort. Of course, your comments were much richer, but just to summarize that very quickly. I'm going to move to Maria-José Poddey from GIZ. So Maria-José was born in Spain and raised in Germany, Argentina, and Brazil. Yeah, cool. Her professional career covers the areas of climate change, renewable energy, and energy efficiency in South America, ASEAN, as well as in the private sector. Since 2020, Maria-José has been the head of the Climate Policy Support Program, advising the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany, also BMZ, on climate change topics. Welcome, Maria-José. So, can you define or describe the compliance and integrity measures that GIZ has in place company-wide? And while you do that, could you also elaborate on experiences of GIZ during project development and implementation of adaptation projects in this context? Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Ibrahim, for inviting us to this panel. And also thank you, Joe, for guiding us through the panel. So I'm very pleased to see also other organizations we are working with. And coming back to your question, compliance and integrity are fully integrated into GIZ DNA and are the backbone of GIZ. And this is why it's very important and timely to highlight how prevent maladaptation within the entire project cycle, from planning to implementation and also from monitoring to evaluation. So we do ensure that integrity are in all our projects, compromising climate adaptation projects during the project planning, development, implementation, and also closure. And compliance is an important foundation of GIZ's work and credibility. So we have established a compliance management system that is a guiding framework for the entire corporate culture. It is designed to align everybody's behavior within the company's value and principles of integrity, anti-corruption, and abiding by rules. It covers all preventive, explanatory, and reactive measures implemented by GIZ to maintain compliance and integrity. And we do have a safeguard and gender management system, which serves to protect people and environment of our projects, in our projects. So what we do conduct a review of effects of proposed activities, including also implications on human rights, and propose safeguard measures against potential unwanted effects. So by providing recommendations on how to encounter them. So in the early project cycle, we do carry out a check or due diligence also of partner organizations. And this is integrated in our internal design of the project implementation in the most effective way. And all these measures are standard procedures applied to all projects that we as GIZ do implement with our partners in the countries. So why do we do that? So just maybe some general facts and figures. I would say that around 1/3 of our portfolio is climate-related and relevant projects and covering mitigation and adaptation to equal share. And our approach is, of course, partner-oriented. And we have an adaptive management, stakeholder engagement, monitoring, and accounting framework. We have a capacity building, a technical assistant, and also grant intermediation, which enable results and sustainable impact on the ground. So with this, it's our duty to have working with the partners, establishing a long-term and trusted close collaboration, and also understanding what are the country's needs and priorities. And we do have concrete project examples, also working in Grenada on a water project, and we do implement it financed by GCF, and the Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety under the International Climate Initiative. So within this project, we do apply all those standards we have. And it's our duty to do so on working on behalf of the German government.
So if I can provoke you a little bit on that.
Please do so.
What have you learned from all of this? So you've now looked at quite a portfolio of projects, and what are your key takeaways? And perhaps using that to also dwell on, if you think that capacity building within institutions is a good way to perhaps cover those integrity gaps that you may have witnessed. Mm-hmm. So tell us where you found and what were, what kinds of integrity gaps you did find, and then if you think capacity building is one way to address them.
Thank you so much, Joe, because we've been talking about this with Ibrahim just before the panel. So, of course, I mean, the mistakes done are, most of them are human. So it's about learning from mistakes, and also to think ahead of what could go wrong. And also having like localized maybe adaptation projects. And if we do scale it up, we need to think ahead what could go wrong. And to also think that all those measurements, ideas, adaptation projects, and including standards, it costs time and money. And we need to include those ideas from the beginning. So it's not quite easy. So it's a constant learning.
Time and money.
Time and money.
Yeah. So thanks very much for that, Maria-José. So key takeaway for me, definitely give time and money to thinking about how we can anticipate possibly integrity. Go for it.
Of course, and also putting our brains together. Brains, yeah, and find creative solutions as well. Yeah.
Okay. I hope when we have time for Q&A, I'm going to ask you about creative solutions, what you have found. Okay, but also I like that you thought about preventive, anticipatory, and curative, so ex post sort of actions, and also data systems that GIZ has built and I guess will continue to strengthen. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to move to Brice Böhmer. Brice Böhmer leads Transparency International's work on climate and environment. He joined Transparency International in 2012 after 7 years of working as a consultant on sustainable development at the European Commission, as well as environmental ministries and the private sector. His current role includes overseeing different anti-corruption programs and managing projects on transparency, accountability, integrity in climate finance and action. He is also representing Transparency International at different institutions, including being on the steering committee of the Alliance for Land, Indigenous and Environmental Defenders, as well as an observer for the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the UNFCCC. Brice, I hope you're online. So I have a question for you. Very good, thanks. According to you, Brice, what do you think can be the impact or the consequences of corruption and integrity failures on adaptation projects? Over to you, please.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the Green Climate Fund Integrity Unit for organizing this event, and to all of the panelists and the audience as well. Well, I think in two words, the response would be the impact can be and is catastrophic and disastrous. I think because of the nature of climate finance and adaptation, and for different reasons, including one that you mentioned, Joe, actually, which is, what is actually climate finance and what is adaptation? And, there's still no clear, official, recognized definition of what is climate finance and what should be counted and not. So there are, for that reason, but also for a number of reasons, or other reasons, including those specific sectors where that money is flowing that have very high levels of corruption. And also, the fact, if you compare the map of the climate vulnerability to the map of index in terms of the perceived level of corruption, there is a very good match. And this is not the good news, because this means that there are very high levels of corruption risks for climate finance and for adaptation. So what are we talking about here? Well, it can take different forms, and we had some of the examples, for example, in the video, and some forms of corruption that we define. Also talking about, what are we talking about? We define as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So this is quite large definition that includes different forms of corruption. One of them, for example, is undue influence. And this undue influence can enable specific corporate interests, for example, to capture specific policies or specific projects. And think of what is happening at COP, for example. If the fossil fuel industry will be a delegation, this will be the biggest delegation that we have at COP. Is that, is that something that is acceptable and fair and good for what we are trying to reach? I think the response is no. And at the same time, you see indigenous people and communities, as some previous speakers, like Coleen mentioned, having difficulties being in the room of the negotiations and even following the negotiations. I'm not even speaking about, being at the table or being able to speak up. So here you can see, I think, that those issues, whereas at the global level, at the national level, or at the very local level, there are different risks of that corruption. And I think, as also Yannick said in his intervention, I would say at best, corruption can decrease the quality of adaptation infrastructure, for example, or at best, again, adaptation measures can be insignificant, but at worst, it can have very negative impacts on the environment, having negative environmental impacts, but also on people on the ground. So as we started discussing as well before, this can lead to abuse in terms of human rights. It can lead to land grabbing. It can lead to different negative impacts for the people on the ground. So our research, for example, in Bangladesh has shown that looking at a portfolio of climate adaptation projects, 1/3 of the funding was embezzled. So that, I would say, is the base case scenario, so to speak. We lost that money. That money is lost. The local community, not for everyone, but for the local communities that were supposed to benefit from it, it is lost. So it means that, if there is, for example, an extreme event happening in those communities, probably they won't be protected against the impact of those events. And this is also another example that we have seen that is actually mentioned in the brief that is being launched today. And this was about building a shelter house. But this shelter house has been built on, very near the property of a local politician that wanted this shelter to be near him. But the problem is that near him means that this shelter is very far away from the communities that could need it. And it's even on the other side of the river. So imagine that there is a flooding happening, as it will be happening at some point, this means that this investment is useless and threatening these people's lives. So I think that's about the impact that we are talking about maladaptation and caused by integrity failures.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Brice. What do you think is the role of civil society organizations in in ensuring that adaptation projects don't fall into this low level or vicious circle, really, of maladaptation?
Thanks. Yeah, I think civil society can play a key role, and you know, I building on what Coleen was saying. Of course, you know, we have. I mean, we've seen that in many projects where indeed, you know, the project has been designed or even sometimes is being implemented from, you know, someone sitting in Glasgow or Berlin like me, you know, but very remote from where the communities are. And I think it can be mismanagement. It can be something, or you know, ill conception. But often, why are those people not being included around the table? Well, maybe because the people implementing the project don't have an interest of having those communities around the table, because then they wouldn't be able to get, for example, a big share of that project. And there I'm also having in mind some specific projects we've seen, for example, in the Maldives, where, you know, a big share of the project was going to some international consultants. And, you know, I've been a consultant, I have nothing against international consultants, but, you know, there is the role for them. But you need to make sure that indeed ideally the solutions are led by, and the design and the implementation is led to some extent by those communities on the ground. So I think for civil society, there is a role to play. There, I would say first in terms of improving the access to information about the projects, but it's also about, you know, the topics. And I think, as also Joe, you were mentioning, how do we learn from the projects, from the experience that we have? How do we evaluate, you know, has this project actually had the impact that was intended? For adaptation, it's maybe a bit easier, but, you know, think about mitigation. I know it's not the topic of today, but, you know, think about the complexity of measuring that. And I think it's very important to have independent evaluations of those projects. And what we are trying to do, for example, through our research and through some tools online, we are building an atlas of cases of climate corruption. So we are trying to look at, okay, what is the you know, the variety of those cases and the diversity of those in a way, and you know, where are they coming from? And what we've seen so far is that they are coming from everywhere, because, you know, we have the tendency sometimes to think that corruption is only in the global south, whereas often it's actually driven by the global north or some actors in the global north. So that's one thing. I think the second one, indeed, around what we discussed already, participation. So make sure civil society can and is participating, you know, at the different level. And I think there again, to talk about this COP, there has been a good move towards, you know, realizing and recognizing the role of indigenous peoples, for example. The third one, I would say, is around making sure that some redress mechanisms are existent and accessible, again, to people who need those mechanisms or potentially who need them. And one example here is making sure that whistleblowers are protected. I think, yeah, there is a better understanding now of the value of those whistleblowers, but there is still, you know, those people are at risk and you know, sometimes are being killed or losing their jobs at the best case again. And then I would say throughout the project, the participation is also about monitoring the project. So I think civil society can be very useful in making sure things don't go wrong, and if things go wrong, that we can you know, react quickly. And one of the tools we would like to pilot, and I'm hoping we could do that on the Green Climate Fund project soon, would be what we call Integrity Pact. So it's a system that has been used for you know, more classic projects or other projects, especially looking at the procurement stage, but not necessarily only procurement stage of a project, but it can be throughout the whole project, where independent civil society.
Sorry.
Independent civil society monitoring is part of how the project is being handled. And last point before finishing is, recognizes as well that these integrity questions are part of broader frameworks. So understanding better and reinforcing the integrity frameworks of the country, for example, or at the local level of where a specific project is, and also reinforcing the integrity mechanisms and policies of environmental bodies, for example. And there is also best practice example with the peer-to-peer alliance.
Thank you, Brice. Okay, I'm going to move over to our next speaker while recognizing that a couple of the things that Brice spoke about was recognizing that it's important to have these independent functions. I'm definitely a big fan of that, no surprise. But also recognizing that it's important to understand the why and the how of the decisions that did get made, right? So it's not just important to look at the consequence of it, but also the why and the how. Well, I'm going to move over to Rennie Valladares. Sorry, I think I got the pronunciation of your last name a little bit off. Rennie is the head of the Integrity Office of CABEI and holds a master's degree in international trade management, has more than 13 years of experience in multilateral banking, and has contributed to the implementation of systems in integrity, sanctions, and money laundering and terrorism financing administration at the regional level for CABEI. Welcome, Rennie. So my question to you, hi there. My question to you is, in your experience, what preventive integrity tools can help mitigate maladaptation? And what do you consider to be some of the more efficient mechanisms to ensure transparency in adaptation projects? It's 4:16. You'll have till about 4:21. Rennie, over to you.
Thank you very much. I myself am a survivor of the Hurricane Mitch in Honduras. So I was really excited when I heard the address speech and the introduction. As Professor Coleen mentioned, for me, preventive integrity tool starts by governance. It's so important who's making the decisions, the responsibility for those who make the decisions. That's the first step. And also invest in pre-investment studies prior to project. There is where all the integrity risk assessment has to take place. Proper due diligence in order for organizations to address all those red flags that are being identified, mitigate those risks prior to project initiation. It's really important to build capacity. We talk about integrity tools. We talk about having people understanding, having people being engaged. So we have to definitely build capacity. Raising awareness is super important for executing agencies. And the importance of what are red flags, what are mitigating, what is risk, what is fraud, what is corruption, and the essence of how to report. And in which stage should they be reporting if fraud, corruption, or any other integrity risk arises that can lead to maladaptation of projects. It's really important to support and build capacity. I myself believe that transparency and access to project information in all the phases is really relevant. And also procurement processes, access to of everything that has to do with the procurement processes for the civil society and everything, and everybody who has access to information on the project is key. Because there is, if you did not address any integrity risk in your pre-investment studies or in your integrity risk assessment or in your due diligence, and your executing agency has not reported, you will always have, if you have available the information of your project, the procurement process, and of the person, and not only natural but juridical persons participating in the operation, you can have civil society and become that whistleblower, let you know as an organization that things have gone wrong and that you have to seek attention. Because it's really important for the development objective of projects to take place. We invest time, we invest money, we invest in mitigating and have all those risk assessments. So we must as well invest in the solutions. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. Thank you for stopping within time. I might just ask you a very quick follow-up question. That's a prize for being really good on time. There is a potential within adaptation projects, Rennie, to overlook integrity considerations at the design stage. What is CABEI's strategy in this sense to ensure that integrity is in place across the project lifecycle? So I'll probably give you a minute. I know it's not sufficient, but you've got it.
It's really important to have our prohibited practice policy. It's not that we have not had cases, but we have to learn from our lessons, right? Lessons learned. I think that's a way to say it in English. But what our prohibited practice policy not only is a definition or a zero tolerance recognition, but it states the responsibility of each of the areas that contribute to the life cycle of the project. So that's why governance is really relevant, because it's not only up to the integrity office, it's up to the people who are in the procurement office, who are in the climate change office, who are in the front line with the commercial. They have a role in CABEI's prohibited practice policy, and they have a responsibility for integrity, due diligence, and awareness to take place. And each of the procedures are defined and are reviewed in order for it for each person to understand which are the stages that they have to take. So they all aim. I call the CABEI's prohibited practice policy the first policy in which everyone was engaged. Everyone had a responsibility. So we all seek to support our objective through our integrity prohibited practice policy. So I think that is a key.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Rennie. So you essentially highlighted the importance of engaging, but everyone really taking the responsibility of ensuring this over the entire life cycle of the project and the investment, as well as building, I think, that capacity across the institution. It's my deep privilege now to move to Ibrahim Pam. Ibrahim is the head of GCF's Independent Integrity Unit and really requires no introduction, but I'm going to try something. He's previously worked as an analyst and investigator in the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, and then has been chief investigator at the Integrity and Anti-Corruption Department of the African Development Bank. As delegate, Ibrahim has participated in the drafting of the African Union Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption, as well as on the UN Convention Against Corruption. He also has assisted in developing the general principles for review of investigative offices of the Conference of International Investigators. Most recently, he was resident investigator at the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services for the UN mission in South Sudan. And Ibrahim holds a Bachelor of Law from the University of Jos and a Master's in Criminal Justice Policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Ibrahim, GCF has a zero tolerance policy against prohibitive practices. Can you please tell us as to how IIU, or the Independent Integrity Unit, ensures that integrity is built in GCF's finance projects? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jo. So the thematic brief that we've had the privilege to launch this afternoon addresses the question of what safeguards that the GCF applies to its projects, particularly with respect to ensuring that adaptation projects are properly implemented. But thanks to Yannick for the description of the intersection between corruption and adaptation, and the very vivid examples of the beautiful bridge in Honduras, which no longer has a river to bridge over. But also the example of the eucalyptus trees in Kenya, which you provided. I think the issue for us is that we are focused on the implications of integrity failures in adapting in GCF adaptation projects and also in mitigation projects, and we're concerned with the fact that there's an increasing portfolio of adaptation projects, and so we thought to focus with our partners to speak about the issues around what could result in maladaptation. What we do at the IIU is we implement a preventive, proactive approach to dealing with integrity issues in GCF projects. And that's constituted of a number of elements. The first element is we've created a policy environment that provides adequate safeguards in the different aspects of integrity matters. We have a policy on prohibited practices which sets out what exactly constitutes prohibited practices, which sets out also their prohibitions. We also have a policy, very importantly, on anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Obviously, dealing with, I think so far, 137 countries and numerous projects in different parts of the world. Climate financing is subject to the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing. So we've elaborated a policy that addresses those risks and provides proper due diligence environment to detect them. We've also, interestingly, have had the board approve a policy on sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. As you know, these are very current issues, and they impact very heavily on reputational risk for institutions such as the GCF, and in addition to other global development institutions, financing institutions. And so we have this really robust and progressive policy, which is now incorporated into our environmental and social safeguards for the GCF. In addition, we now have a policy on administrative sanctions, and that's an important policy. It's called the Administrative Remedies and Exclusions Policy, because that then provides the enforcement authority for dealing with integrity failures. Now, all of this, and we're developing subsidiary documents for that policy as well. All of this provides a very robust policy environment for ensuring integrity in GCF policies. We have aligned all of these policies as well with the legal agreements that the GCF has with its accredited entities. So all of the GCF's accredited entities are required to implement and to have similar policy frameworks that align with the GCF's integrity standards. And I know that we have on the panel, but also in the live audience and also online, representatives of entities who have been accredited, who have met these standards, and who continue to propagate them. Our view at the Independent Integrity Unit is that we position ourselves as the global leader in climate integrity, climate finance integrity. And we do this by creating strategic alliances with our partners in order to establish common standards for maintaining integrity in climate financing. Because we believe that the entire quantum of resources that are put forward to deal with climate change must be applied transparently and accountably to exactly the mission, the critical mission of reversing climate change. And that builds trust for the institution, and it builds confidence, not only for contributors, but also for beneficiary communities. And therefore, we work closely with civil society as well. Our work with civil society is driven by the understanding that in order to accelerate our footprint and to be more effective in monitoring projects at local community levels, we need to have the support and the assistance of particularly community-based civil society groups. And so we reach out to civil society. We're forming a coalition of integrity with important players in that space, but also in addition to advocacy groups, especially some of the more renowned like Transparency International that we work with, and the civil society observers on the board, but also with private sector observers. Now, one of the more important elements of the work we're doing, and I know that the time is short, but if I may, I'll speak on this, is we've developed very advanced tools using artificial intelligence and data analytics to create a tool that is able to do a couple of things. One is a risk rating of GCF projects in our portfolio. As you know, our portfolio at the GCF recently exceeded $10 billion of GCF financing, but a total asset portfolio exceeding, I think it's $33 billion now. And so as the GCF portfolio grows, our exposure necessarily to the risks of corruption also grows as well. Therefore, we appreciate the need to use intelligence automation in order to be able better to, by examining and by looking at the data that's coming from projects, to determine the risks that our projects are faced with. So we have this tool which we intend to also popularize with accredited entities that takes all of the data, it runs it through a statistical model that determines the elements of risk. We've applied this recently to our portfolio, and we've done a rating of we identified 10 priority projects. What that tool enables us to do is to focus our proactive measures around those projects that seem to be more problematic. And in fact, the financing instruments, and the tool tells us that the grant instrument is probably more prone to red flagging. But yes, I mean, I'll probably stop there. But just to say that our work is constantly looking to advance knowledge and to create more partnerships and to build more coalitions around integrity matters. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Given that this is the Credibility Cup, I thought that I should let you go on a little bit about it, but I really appreciated the use of artificial intelligence, using training data, and then also looking ahead and getting really future fit for a portfolio that's clearly going to grow, right? And also the use of these proactive measures to then look at high-risk projects. Really appreciate that. And also, I think what you said in terms of positioning the Independent Integrity Unit as the leader in the climate finance integrity space, I think is a really important global good that we can all benefit from. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to Barbara Schreiner, who's from the Water Integrity Network. Barbara has over 25 years of experience in water management in developing countries, especially in Africa. And has focused a lot of her work on good governance and addressing poverty, inequality, gender, and other forms of social and economic marginalization. She's worked as a consultant as well as a senior manager in the public sector, but also at the ministerial level, and has been active in a number of international boards in the water sector, and has also published variously on issues of water governance. Barbara, my question to you is that WIN has been increasing its engagement focused on the interface of climate adaptation and water integrity. what are your main messages for other sector actors based on what you've been picking up? And what do you think should be key messages that they take away and that they can use from what you've learned? Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Jo. I was waiting for you to say over to you, and you've got 2 minutes. But since you didn't say that, I'll see how much time I can take. There's always a challenge coming at the end of a long list of people, because so much of what I want to say has been said, and said extremely well by the people coming before me. But I think, this whole issue of climate adaptation and maladaptation and corruption is one that really exercises our minds in the water integrity network. Obviously, being in the water sector, we're hugely concerned about the issue of climate adaptation, because so many of the impacts of climate change are playing out in the water sector in relation to the changes in rainfall, evaporation, floods, droughts, storms, and they're critical in the water sector. But obviously, those are exactly the same things that are also impacting on other sectors. So all of the sectors are vulnerable to climate change. And there's a lot of money coming in to the sector, and it's into the adaptation field. And it's coming in through a range of different pathways. A lot of it going into infrastructure, although by no means everything going into infrastructure. And all of this raises concerns for us around, so what does corruption mean? How does this going to play out in terms of, are we actually going to be able to deliver decent adaptation or not? And one of the things that I just want to say here is that within the corruption field, infrastructure is one of the areas that is particularly prone to corruption for fairly self-evident reasons. And there are estimates of how much gets lost in terms of investment in corruption in infrastructure. But what is of more concern to us is, so what are the impacts in terms of possibly not achieving adaptation options, or possibly actually driving maladaptation for corruption? And there's a lot of work that's been done around procurement, and obviously corruption in procurement may well have maladaptation, be a driver of maladaptation as well. But one of the things that was keeping us awake at night, and that actually drove us to engage so strongly with the GCF around the policy brief that's just been launched this afternoon, was how does corruption even influence this process right from the beginning of conceptualization of projects? And when Brice talks about the shelter that was built near the politician's house, that wasn't corruption in the procurement or the later stages. That was corruption that came in right up front in the conceptualization. And the question we're asking is, do we know enough about how that plays out and what can be done to actually mitigate corruption influencing the decisions right from the beginning of the process, and therefore ending up with some fairly severe maladaptation or failure to adapt. I think it was Charles Kenny way back in 2006 who said that the forms of corruption most harmful to development outcomes, and actually you can now read this in 2021 as being most harmful for adaptation outcomes, are one, corruption that influences project appraisal, design, and budgeting, and then secondly, corruption during project implementation. So those are the areas that we're particularly concerned about. What is the message for other sectors? The message for other sectors is, if this is possible in the water sector, it's also going to happen in other sectors. Corruption plays out in the same way, slight differences, but pretty much in the same way across sectors. And I think for me, part of the message is, we don't yet know enough. We know about the possibility. We need to explore it more. I think, Jo, you yourself referred to robust evidence that we need. Coleen mentioned that we don't really even know enough about maladaptation yet. We need to understand much better, how do corruption and maladaptation, lack of integrity and maladaptation, how are those linked? What are we actually seeing? And then what are the most appropriate mechanisms to deal with them? And are the mechanisms that are in place? And we've heard a lot from development finance institutions this afternoon about the kind of mechanisms that they have in place. Are those sufficient? Are those working in terms of what is happening at national level, at local level, whatever, around adaptation programs? How do we then develop solutions? And I think for me, one of the things that is critical for all sectors is to recognize that this is a real risk. And in recognizing that, say, okay, the investment that is required in understanding the risk better and in then putting in place mechanisms to reduce the risk, that investment is worth it in terms of the value for money that it saves. The return on investment is huge in terms of what is a relatively small investment around the governance and the integrity management practices that need to be put in place to make it work. So I really think that what we're seeing and what we'd like to convey to other sectors is that there's a need for better evidence, there's a need for better understanding, and then there is a need for absolutely firm commitment and action. It's absolutely critical that we reduce corruption in the climate adaptation sector. We really do. This is not about nice to have. This is about actually saving lives, and so it's critically important that we invest the time and energy that is necessary to actually turn things around.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I particularly appreciated your comments because there's one other similarity between corruption and adaptation that your remarks brought out, which is that in both cases, it's really hard to understand and to measure what is the avoided cost of each one of these phenomena, right? When you are trying to prevent corruption, it's really hard to make that value for money case. If you're able to prevent it, and then to be able to go to your contributors as well as to then institution, that this has been the avoided corruption. Because if you've been able to avoid it, there's no way for you to measure what that benefit has been. And it's the same thing with climate adaptation as well. It's very hard to measure what has been avoided as a consequence of adaptive activities. And that has been a challenge also in the adaptation sector. So I really appreciated that insight, actually, Barbara. And thank you very much for that. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the close of our moderated panel session in the sense of having prepared questions from my side. But I'm going to open it up to our virtual audience as well as our live audience. I think the way this works is that Albert gives us questions that have been fed into the Mentimeter that all of you have access to, and I direct it to members of the panel. And then, for reasons that are not clear to me, there will be an online audience that will get first preference on Q&A, and then we'll have our live audience that will also get a say in terms of Q&A. So, Albert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. It seems that they've changed things on us a little bit, but we have received some questions, and I will go ahead and read that out, and maybe, Joe, you can direct it to the appropriate panelists. So just give me a second. Let me get it out here. All right, first question. Are there any emerging technologies like blockchain you are looking at to deploy to help transparency and fight corruption?
Great question. So emerging technologies to fight corruption. Ibrahim, I'm actually going to direct that question to you. I think it was, you spoke about artificial intelligence and you spoke about using anticipatory algorithms to understand as to what we can do. So, yeah. But anyone else from the panel, if you'd like to volunteer a 30-second intervention, I will allow it. So, Ibrahim, over to you first. Do you want to take mine?
Thank you, Joan, and thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one because at the Independent Integrity Unit, we're very conscious of innovation and moving into the use of technology. Just a word on the measurement question, I think, if I may. And I'd probably also spoken with you about issues around how do you measure the impact of preventative measures. And I think there are methodologies out there which are validated, especially in the crime prevention space for measuring impact. But back to the technology question, what we have done at the Independent Integrity Unit at the GCF is to, as I said, to elaborate a program for data analytics. We think that there's a great opportunity in exploiting big data to determine risks in projects. We hired a data engineer who's extremely competent, and as well my colleague Albert, who's been on the other side online, who runs the forensics program for the GCF. And they've created this intelligence automation tool that takes all of our project data and, as I said, analyzes it along certain parameters and does a risk rating. That's the kind of technology that then feeds into a proper proactive integrity review process. So you take the outcomes of that risk rating, and then you're able to focus your interventions on either particular specific projects that have shown up, or in fact, you take a thematic approach and you look at financing instruments that seem to be more prone or more vulnerable to corruption, or even perhaps a regional approach. And one of the things we're also thinking of doing, hopefully we can get that into the 2022 work plan, is to develop a heat mapping of GCF projects around the world. What that would entail is to use geographic information systems, GIS mapping, to actually locate GCF projects and then apply another layer of analysis on top of that, which is derived from the statistical modeling that we do. And that way you can actually have a visual that shows you across the world how your projects are doing. So yes, the use of technology, we could talk about that for a while, but I think it's extremely important in the work we do.
And just to add to that, Ibrahim, perhaps you could also think about creating a layer of what you also know about accredited entities and the information that has been revealed to you, and creating a GIS layer and overlaying that over the heat map to then try and see as to what is happening in non-GCF areas. So to really speak about, well, how well the GCF's integrity function is doing, because this is something that IFAD does. So we look at, for example, where IFAD investments are going in, but then we also have data on socioeconomics, policy, geophysical data for surrounding landscapes where IFAD investments are not working, but where climate shocks have occurred, and how well or not well populations have responded there compared to IFAD areas, right? And so it helps us then understand as to what the additional impact of IFAD investments have been. So perhaps you could use something like that to then understand the additional impact of clearly what is a GCF integrity policy, right?
Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Joe. I think obviously that's an area that I'll come to you to see if we can collaborate. But that's absolutely useful to have a comparative analysis with other domains. So
fantastic.
Yes, you'll hear from me very soon, I think.
Okay, wonderful. Albert, do we have other questions? Otherwise, I'll open it up to the floor here.
We do have some questions, but I think we may want to take some live questions from the floor. But we also have Barbara, who's got her hand up. I believe she's got an intervention.
Sorry.
Yes, I wanted to come in on the
Barbara?
On the blockchain question, if I
yes,
may.
Please do. Thank you.
And no, we're not using blockchain yet, but there is a fair amount of exploratory work being done around blockchain. But I want to talk a little bit about technology, and it links to the whole challenge of being able to measure corruption as well. And it links very, very closely to what Ibrahim has just talked about as well. We have developed something. We wanted to find a way of measuring levels of corruption, but we know that that's an extremely difficult thing to do. So we developed an index, which is the Water and Sanitation Integrity Risk Index, which is based on big data analytics. And it takes three elements, and it's focused on trying to measure the integrity risk at city level. So that you can then actually have an index of the integrity risk at city level. And it's a composite index that brings together three elements based on big data analytics to actually give you an index around city level integrity risk.
Yeah, thanks for that, Barbara. And also blockchain. Actually, IFAD is developing blockchain and has used it in quite a few. So we can see for every dollar and by contributor, which farmer it reaches. And so we're piloting that as well. Okay. I'm going to open it up to our live audience here. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to look up from your phones and ask a question of our online panelists as well as our live panelists, this is a good time. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself very briefly on the mic.
Hi. My name is Shira. I come from the SPNI. It's Israel's largest environmental NGO. And I have to be honest, I sat in this panel quite accidentally and my mind exploded because I never thought of this aspect before. And we are hopefully about to roll out several projects in something like 10 municipalities. And the aspects of corruption has never crossed my mind, actually. And I think that even if I'm naive and I think that it will never happen in our projects, even as an example of how to run a project that is like completely see-through and very open, I think it's a very important value. And I would really appreciate any pointers to how, as I don't remember her name, but what we can do from the beginning of the project to make sure that it will go this way and to make sure that these values echo inside the work.
Okay. Maria-José, do you want to take that question? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. So we do have different systems in places as well as I was telling. So first of all, we are all, of course, looking at GIZ colleagues. You know, it's also capacity building and training for us because there's so many different situations and countries we're working on. So it's a constant learning. So we do have online trainings, might it be only 1 or 2 hours or like in-depth training. So this would be one example. Then we have, of course, rules and regulations, right? In place, be it on compliance system, being on gender and safeguard, also on sexual harassment, how to behave, and then also taking in account the rules and regulations coming from our donors, right? We're working on behalf of the German government, but also, of course, cooperating, for example, with GCF, other donors. So it's a huge, it's a challenging task, but it takes time and money to go through it, and it's important to do so because otherwise you will encounter so many different difficult situations where you don't know what to do, and it's good to have at least a plan and also an emergency plan, and yeah, maybe this, and also like having an exchange with other people, and maybe also mentioning putting brains together. I'm very thankful to have this cooperation with Ibrahim also on the peer-to-peer lines, where we do have this very tight exchange, and there's trust, because it's not easy to talk about failures and what could go wrong. There's a huge exposure also in our case, and so this is what we do, talking about failures and how to make it better.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to the gentleman here, please. If you could come up and just introduce yourself. Albert, if there's a salient question online that you want to just prime us on, that would be good. And maybe we can take both questions together before we end. Time is up. Okay. We have two questions. Well, and time is up. But
okay, my name is Isifu Sulemana. I'm from Ghana, and I work for a civil society organization. It's a small NGO, a local one, of course. We are farmers. I was so happy to see the heading, and that is what actually struck me so much. Now, my question is, where we come from, it is not only Ghana, but it's a major issue when it comes to the whole sub-Saharan Africa. As we speak now, Ghana has won 2 projects. I'm aware of the Share Landscape, which is going to take place in the northern Ghana. So the question I want to ask you is, given the nature of our countries, our mindset, our culture, and all those things, in the event that during implementation, some of this corruption, as we all perceive, because mostly when it passes through government sector and any other, this thing is difficult to, there's so many manipulations. In that case, what option do you have if it is going on? Do you have any other option? And if maybe the ultimate option is to withdraw the project, then what happens to we, the farmers, who are going to be the beneficiary of the project? What are you going to do with us?
Yeah.
Yes, because of someone's problem, then we suffer it. So I want to know, when it happens, I'm not saying it will happen, but in case it happens, what happens to us?
Yeah, really, really good question. And perhaps I actually think this is a great way to end the panel. Apologies. I can't take any more questions, but what I am going to do is to combine our last comments from, I know, Ibrahim, and I'll just wrap it up. I'm going to make no attempt whatsoever to summarize everything that has been richly said, except to say that clearly I think this is the elephant in the room, right? What happens to the beneficiaries, the stakeholders that are on the ground, that are the people that we are working with, who are going to be impacted as a consequence of that corruption, of that maladaptation, of that lack of integrity that we are going to be able to detect. But there is an expectation there, and there is planning there that has gone on in the context of especially the communities that we work with that are predicated on that financing, on that funding. So what happens to that? And that's really the last mile. That's why we are all here, right? That's the difference that we want to make. It's really critical, and I'm so glad that you brought this up, because this is, participation is all very good, time and budget's all very good, policies are all very good, credibility is all very good. But finally, if we are not able to make a difference in the lives of the people that we serve, then we have failed, right? So, Ibrahim, over to you to close this event, but hopefully to try and address a very critical question in the room. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Suleiman. I think, as Joe said, your question really resolves the entire dilemma of why we work in integrity in the climate space. And that's exactly why in our thinking, in addition to all the innovations that we propose, in addition to all the work that we do with policy and safeguarding and technology and using tools, the most important thing really is to connect with the beneficiaries. And that's why our intention is to engage with community-based civil society groups. Now, I'll tell you, because it is those groups, whether they're faith-based or they're There are groups of cooperatives in different sectors. It is those groups who actually have their feet on the ground, who see the impacts and who see the challenges and the risks of integrity failures. And that's why in Ghana, for example, we're speaking with the West Africa Civil Society Organization. Yeah, exactly. It's based in Accra. And our discussion with them really is, how do we use your reach to actually be in touch with people like you, the farmers and the artisans and all those who are beneficiaries of GCF financing. And that's where I think not only can we connect with you, but we can also build a bridge for you to connect with us. So our whistleblower policy, for example, we're looking to translate that into local languages as far as we can, using the resources and facilities of partners. And we're looking to provide protected reporting so that you more easily are able to reach the channels of communication in Ghana, for example, rather than in Korea, if you see what I mean. So we're looking to build those bridges of communication to expand and to reach out. But I'd encourage you to also proactively sort of reach out to us as well. Let's engage with you and see how we can better create these partnerships. And when I talk about strategic partnerships, it's not only with institutions, but it's also with you, the people who we work for. And as Joe said, that's the last mile, really. But thank you for your comment.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our session. There is another session that is planned here. Thank you so much for your engagement, for your energy. And thank you very much to the IIU for organizing this session. Thank you. And thank you for the panelists for being extremely energetic, passionate, and for doing the things that you are. Bye for now.